There's a particular kind of chaos that doesn't announce itself with sirens or breaking alerts. It announces itself quietly through the words of the people in charge. Words that don't hold together. Words that contradict yesterday's words. Words that dissolve the moment you press on them. And right now, in the middle of a war that didn't have to happen, those words are everywhere. Not just careless words, not just clumsy words, words that reveal with startling clarity that the people speaking them have no idea what they're doing. This is not an exaggeration made for effect. This is the observable, documentable reality of Donald Trump's war. And the more you look at it, really look at it, the more disturbing it becomes. Let's start with Steve Witkoff. If you're not familiar with the name, you're not alone, and that's actually part of the problem. Steve Witkoff is a 68-year-old real estate developer from New York. He has no formal diplomatic training, no background in intelligence, no history in government, and by every conventional measure, no qualifications for the role he has been handed by the President of the United States. And yet here he is, serving as one of America's key negotiators, not just in the Middle East, where Jared Kushner, Trump's son-in-law, has already staked a claim to the title of most improbable peace negotiator in modern history, but also in Moscow, sitting across a table from Vladimir Putin. Think about that for a moment. Vladimir Putin is one of the most calculating, strategic, and ruthlessly effective political operators on the planet. He has been maneuvering inside and around the world's power structures for decades. He has outfoxed intelligence agencies, survived sanctions, annexed territory, and managed to remain relevant and feared in global affairs through sheer persistence and an extraordinarily precise understanding of how leverage works. And Donald Trump's answer to this is to send Steve Witkoff. Now, perhaps you'd expect that after meeting with Putin, Witkoff might have absorbed something, might have come away with at least a working sense of how the Russian president operates. But when CNBC anchor Carl Quintanilla sat down with Witkoff and asked him directly about something genuinely consequential, whether Russia had been sharing intelligence about the locations of American military assets with Iran, and if so, why on earth the United States was still offering waivers on Russian oil sanctions, Witkoff's answer was something to behold. He said, and I want to be precise here, that he was not an intelligence officer, so he couldn't speak to it. Then he said that on a call with the president the previous day, the Russians had claimed that they had not been sharing intelligence with Iran. And then, somehow, with cameras rolling and a nation watching, Steve Witkoff said the following: "We can take them at their word. We can take them at their word." Let that settle in. After credible investigative reporting from multiple major outlets, reporting that Russia had been actively helping Iran coordinate attacks targeting American military personnel, attacks that killed 7 American soldiers and left 140 others injured, all Vladimir Putin had to do was pick up the phone and say, "We didn't do it." And Donald Trump's personally selected envoy went on national television and said, essentially, "That sounds fine. Case closed." This is not incompetence at the edges. This is not a minor diplomatic stumble. This is a fundamental, structural failure of judgment at the highest levels of American foreign policy. And the fact that it happened in front of cameras, without hesitation, without embarrassment, tells you something important about the culture that has taken hold inside this administration. But here's where it gets worse. Because Steve Witkoff may actually believe what he's saying. That's the charitable reading. The more disturbing possibility, and Donald Trump himself is Exhibit A for this, is that it doesn't matter whether he believes it. What matters is saying it publicly, putting it on record, giving Putin cover, and then moving on. Donald Trump has done this over and over again. Putin lies to his face, Trump walks to a microphone and tells the world he believes him. Whether Trump is genuinely credulous or whether he is performing credulity as a form of deference, doesn't really change the outcome. The outcome is the same. Vladimir Putin benefits and American credibility suffers. And now, against this backdrop of diplomatic dysfunction, there is the war itself. The war that Trump announced with a signature rhetorical flourish calling for the unconditional surrender of Iran. It was a phrase deployed as a kind of power move, a declaration that sounded like strength, like resolve, like a president who knew where he was going and how the story would end. Except almost immediately, it became clear that no one in the administration, not even Trump himself, had any real idea what it meant. Within 24 hours of that declaration, Trump announced that the United States had, quote, already won, exclamation point, already won, before negotiations had concluded, before any formal document had been signed, before any verifiable change of conditions on the ground. Already won. 3 days after that, an American Tomahawk missile struck a girls' school in Iran. 175 people were killed, most of them students. And then Donald Trump did something that, even by his standards, was breathtaking. He suggested that the missile was fired by Iran. Not by the United States, by Iran, at its own school, killing its own children. Former Navy combat pilot, former astronaut, and sitting U.S. Senator Mark Kelly was asked about this claim, and his response was as clear as it was damning. Trump has no idea what he's talking about. He was correct. Iran does not possess Tomahawk missiles. They never have. The Tomahawk is a distinctly American weapon system. The suggestion that Iran turned an American missile on its own civilian population to presumably frame the United States isn't just false. It's a kind of lie that reveals how completely unmoored from operational reality this administration actually is. Dozens of children are dead. That is not a talking point, that is a fact. And the response from the administration was not accountability, not a swift and transparent investigation, not the kind of sober reckoning that such a tragedy demands. Instead, Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth talked about stupid rules of engagement, his phrase, implying that the very existence of rules, protocols designed to prevent exactly this kind of catastrophic error was itself the problem. No rules of engagement, the logic seemed to go, means more freedom of action. What it actually means, as the rubble of a school illustrates, is more dead children. One Republican senator broke from the pack on this. John Kennedy of Louisiana said simply that it was terrible that the United States made a mistake, and that unlike countries like Russia, America would never do such a thing intentionally. He said he was sorry. He said he was just so sorry it happened. It was, in the midst of the noise and deflection, a sentence that actually sounded like it came from a human being. A sentence that acknowledged reality instead of running from it. Compare that to the White House press secretary, who, when CBS anchor Nancy Cordes asked whether the president was, in fact, making things up to justify the decision to go to war, responded by saying, with apparent sincerity, "The president is not making anything up, Nancy." This from an administration that has offered demonstrably false claims about drapes, about ballrooms, about Tomahawk missiles, about the price of gas, about who pays tariffs, about winning wars that are still actively being fought. If the threshold for not making things up is simply saying things with confidence, then the standard has collapsed entirely. Making things up is not a political accusation in this context. It is a description of an observable pattern. Every day, another demonstrably false claim enters the public record. Every day, it is repeated by surrogates, amplified by allies, and eventually abandoned when reality becomes too insistent to deny, only to be replaced by a new claim, equally untethered from fact. The press secretary's job in this environment is not to inform. It is to maintain the appearance that information is being provided. And this is where history becomes not just relevant, but instructive. Because there was a time, when the White House press secretary's job meant something different, when it came with the expectation of accuracy, when it was understood institutionally that the credibility of the press office was inseparable from the credibility of the presidency itself. Steve Early understood this. You may not know the name, and that's understandable. We are many decades removed from his era. But Steve Early is the man who essentially invented the modern White House press conference. Before he came along, reporters who wanted to ask the president a question had to submit that question in writing in advance. There was no open, live exchange, no accountability in real time. Steve Early changed that. He opened the door of the Oval Office and let the reporters walk in, usually twice a week. And President Franklin Roosevelt took their questions directly, without filters, without preconditions, without favoritism. Roosevelt held more presidential press conferences than any other president in American history. And on the rare occasions when a reporter asked about something he genuinely didn't know, he said so. He admitted it. And then Steve Early would track down the answer and make sure the reporter got it. Not because Roosevelt was performing humility, but because the truth mattered. And being caught in a lie, or even in carelessness, was understood to be corrosive to the authority a wartime president needed to lead. Steve Early also knew what war looked like from the inside. He had earned a Silver Star for bravery in combat during World War I before he ever set foot in the White House. He understood, in a way that only people who have been in harm's way can understand, what was at stake when a nation sent its soldiers into conflict. It was Steve Early who walked into the press room on December 7th, 1941, and confirmed for the American media that Pearl Harbor had been attacked, that the United States had been drawn without warning or consent into the most consequential armed conflict in human history. He did not hedge, he did not deflect, he told the truth. The next day, President Roosevelt delivered a 5-minute address to Congress and asked for a declaration of war against Japan. Congress passed it immediately. Days later, when Germany declared war on the United States, Roosevelt asked for a second declaration. Again, Congress passed it immediately. And then, before the United States had made any significant military progress, before the tide of the war had turned in any visible way, Roosevelt stood up and announced the terms under which the war would end. His terms. American terms. Unconditional surrender. Not as a boast, not as a headline, as a statement of strategic clarity that communicated to the world, to allies, to enemies, to history, exactly what kind of commitment the United States was making. He didn't say the United States had already won. He didn't need to. The phrase unconditional surrender said everything. It said, we are not leaving until this is finished, and finished on our terms. No negotiation, no compromise on fundamentals, complete and total cessation of the enemy's capacity and will to fight. And then the United States made good on it. Germany signed a formal act of surrender, a document written and dictated by the United States, signed in the presence of Allied Supreme Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower. There was no ambiguity, there was no wiggle room. There was a table, a document, and a signature. 3 months later, the same thing happened in Tokyo Bay, aboard the USS Missouri. A Japanese general stood before the assembled forces of the Allied powers and signed an act of surrender in which Japan was permitted to negotiate not a single word, not one clause, not one condition. The war ended on the terms that Roosevelt had declared long before the outcome was certain, in a moment when victory itself was far from guaranteed. That is what unconditional surrender means. That is what it looks like. There is a formality to it, a weight to it, a specificity that transforms a declaration of war aims into a verifiable historical fact. And when Trump's press secretary was asked, 4 days after Trump had called for Iran's unconditional surrender, what that phrase actually meant, what it would look like in practice, she could not answer. She didn't know. Because no one in this administration knows. They don't know what unconditional surrender looks like. They don't know what war looks like. They don't know how oil sanctions interact with geopolitical leverage. They don't know how to assess Russian intelligence claims. They don't know how a Tomahawk missile works, or where it comes from, or who fires it. And crucially, they don't seem to know what they don't know, which is, historically speaking, the most dangerous kind of ignorance there is. There is a difference, a profound and consequential difference, between a president who leads a nation through a war and a president who narrates a war, moment by moment, through an ever-shifting series of claims and counterclaims that have no stable relationship to reality. Roosevelt led. He set terms. He built coalitions. He communicated through the discipline of his press office and the precision of his public statements that the United States knew what it was doing. Americans could look at their president and believe that the suffering, the sacrifice, the cost in lives and treasure was part of a plan that someone actually understood. That faith, the faith between a wartime leader and the people being asked to absorb the consequences of war, is not a luxury. It is an operational necessity. Because wars are hard. They go wrong. They produce tragedies, like a girls' school hit by an American missile. And in those moments, a nation needs to believe that its leaders are telling the truth about what happened, why it happened, and what is being done to make sure it doesn't happen again. Without that faith, every casualty becomes a question mark. Every briefing becomes a performance. Every "we're winning" becomes another line in a script no one believes. Right now, as the missiles keep flying and people keep dying, American soldiers, Iranian students, and everyone in between, the only thing Americans can know for certain is this: take nothing at face value. Verify everything. Believe nothing from this administration until reality independently confirms it. Because this president has made it abundantly and painfully clear that his word is not his bond. It is simply his most recent statement, valid until it becomes inconvenient, at which point it will be replaced by another one. If you've stayed this long with this story, you already understand why it matters. Not as partisan point scoring, not as a culture war grievance, but as something more fundamental. The question of whether the people making life and death decisions on behalf of 330 million Americans actually understand the consequences of those decisions. Whether they've done the work, whether they've earned the right to ask this nation to pay the cost. By every measurable standard, the evidence so far says no. And that is worth saying clearly, loudly, and without apology, because the alternative is silence. And silence is how disasters compound. The children in that school had no say in the war that reached them. The soldiers who died under fire they were not warned about had no say in the intelligence failures that left them exposed. What a nation owes them, at minimum, is the truth. And what this administration continues to offer day after day is something else entirely.